take a deep breath, take a drink. We just experienced a really powerful screening, so I want to take a little moment on that because it was packed, and also we're going to have a lively dialogue, as Dr. Fletcher would say. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
As part of Connor Prairie's honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, I thank you again for joining us for the PBS documentary screening of the first Rainbow Coalition on Independent Lens. To help further discuss this film, Connor Prairie welcomes our panelists of scholars, Dr. Charlene Fletcher and Ms. Sydney-Paige Patterson. I also want to stop and think about today, because most of us really think about Dr. Martin Luther King Day, but today is his actual birthday. And I wanted to take a pause and say happy birthday to Dr. Martin Luther King. If he was alive, he would be 93 years old today. And so that's a very powerful thing, because as we know, he and his mission, and also the things that he did, also the people that actually helped him with this movement, we need to honor that and make sure that we recognize today as his actual birthday and not skip over that. So many times we do that. So I wanted to pause a little bit and give some credit there to say happy birthday. And I don't want to sing like Stevie Wonder. Won't do that. I could. My brother would say is, please don't. But let me welcome our scholars. And I've got some bios to read, and I think it's worth hearing all of it, of the accomplishments, and not to shorten anything. Dr. Fletcher. She is a historian, an educator, and writer, and she is also the curatorial director at Connor Prairie. She holds a PhD in history from Indiana University, specializing in 19th century United States and African American history and gender studies. She also served as a lecturer of criminal justice at the City University of New York and an adjunct lecturer in global and historical studies at Butler University. Dr. Fletcher's research in the forthcoming book explores the experience of confined African American women in Kentucky from Reconstruction to the Progressive Era, specifically illuminating the lives of confined Black women by examining other places like areas of confinement, including mental health institutions and domestic spaces. She seeks to explore how these women both defined and defined confinement through their incarceration, interactions with public, social, and political entities of the period, as well as how they challenge ideals of race and femininity. Ms. Sydney-Paige Patterson. She received her BA in African American and African Diaspora Studies in English from Indiana University, Bloomington. She is also a graduate of the John W. Draper Interdisciplinary Master's Program at New York University. She is currently pursuing a PhD at Indiana University in African Diaspora History with a minor in Indian Studies. Her research examines transnational social movements throughout the 20th century, focusing primarily on how Black Americans have inspired or contributed to the formation of radical movements for the freedom around the world. Her dissertation research utilizes ethnographic and archival methods to interrogate how Black and Dalit women contribute vital intellectual labor to the Black and Dalit Panther parties during the late 20th century. She was recently rewarded a 2020-2021 Fulbright Nehru Fellowship to complete her dissertation study. My name is Marion Carpenter, and I'm the Director of the Interpretation and Historical Research here at the Connor Prairie. I have over 20 years, I'm going to say over 20 years, I'm not going to tell you how many years. It's got another year onto it. Experience in the museum field in the area of curation, collections management, historical research, registrar methodology, and also exhibitions. I am knowledgeable in the history of the civil rights movement, spanning from the 1940s and 1970s. I have a BA in American History from Indiana University. Guess what? We all came from Indiana University. Okay, go Hoosiers. And also, I have an MA in American History with a concentration in African American history from the University of Cincinnati. I was going to say Bearcat. I will be the moderator for this panel discussion, which is being broadcast in our Lilly Theater at Prairie, as well as on our Facebook Live page. So, ladies, welcome. We have a lot of scholarly energy up here, as you can see. We're going to have some dialogue, and also, if there's any questions out in the audience, we're going to entertain those, as well as on our Facebook. So, shall we begin?
Yes.
All right. One of the things that, when I looked at this documentary in its entirety, and it's a screening that I had seen several years ago, it always comes back to me about the Black Panther Party. How they created so many programs, social programs, like the free breakfast program, the free health clinic, and dental clinics, and food pantries. Yet they always want to stereotype the Black Panther Party as a militant group, and not really go any further than that, and not think about what we heard in this film about. They were power for all people, all power to all people, not just some people, but all people. Dr. Fletcher and Ms. Patterson, can you talk about why there's always this seemingly stigma on the Black Panther Party, and how we can really kind of educate people about the Black Panther Party and the things they've done, because there's a lot of things that we now take for granted because they became government programs. Free breakfast program, I remember that when I was in school, and the free health clinics. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is that, and how can we educate people to learn more about the Black Panther Party?
I guess I'll start. So, my first introduction to the Black Panther Party was also that they were a violent group. I had maybe a short blurb in my high school history class. It was like, and Black Panthers existed, but that was about it. And it wasn't until later that I started learning about all the social programs that you mentioned, community programs, and also the coalitions they were building, not just in Chicago, but also in Oakland, right? I was talking to one of the women interviewed, Erica Huggins, last summer, and she mentioned that they were building coalitions for things like Black mothers were dying in hospitals, right, in Oakland in the 70s. And they were like, we need to talk to other women who've experienced this, and a lot of Latino women were living in East Oakland at the same time, and so they were like, we need to form coalitions here to prevent the amount of death that's happening, to make sure these hospitals are being held accountable for the losses of lives that are taking place. So a lot of that coalition building work is often overshadowed by the image of the Panthers that first came out when the organization was founded in October of 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. But the Panthers, as they're very well known for, had a demonstration at the Sacramento courthouse where they militantly invaded the courthouse to protest the police brutality that's happening in Oakland, the patrols, the different ways they were being discriminated against. And that image was broadcast around the world and represented the organization as a terrorist organization. Even though it wasn't until they weren't actually pursued as terrorists as much until they started their social programs. And that's the most interesting part. Once they started doing those actions that were actually about building democracy and building coalitions and providing all power to the people, that's when the FBI got fully involved, fully invested in demolishing the Black Panther Party. But I'll leave some more for Charlene to say.
I had a similar introduction, but I was a very different child. I've always been a militant person. So I had this introduction to the Black Panther Party. Again, like Paige said, you have this blurb. It doesn't tell you who started the Black Panther Party. It doesn't tell you why the Black Panther Party was started. It doesn't tell you that Ronald Reagan was the governor at the, but that's another story. Yeah, they don't tell you about that either. but it's just this image of Black men with guns. And it's supposed to be this scary thing. But for me, when I first saw that image, and I believe that famous image that is in Sacramento, where Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and there's others that are standing in front of the courthouse with these shotguns and these rifles, and I'm like, yeah, because at the time I'm learning these things, and when I was younger, I remember watching Eyes on the Prize, and I had DVDs. I know, Marion, we were talking about that the other day. Yeah, I had the tapes, but see, I had to go. See, I had to go back to PBS and get the DVDs. But I remember seeing pictures of Black people being sprayed with water hoses, and I remember being about my daughter is 10 years old, and I was 10 years old the first time I saw Emmett Till's face. And so to see Huey Newton and Bobby Seale with these guns, we're not taking this. It never struck me as a terrorist organization. The question was, what else are they doing? And so with that in mind, and people not understanding those social programs that are still in existence today, like you said, the free breakfast program. Every child, especially since COVID, every child in the United States has free breakfast and free lunch. That is not mustered up by the federal government. That exists solely because of the Black Panther Party. And for expectant women, women with young children, the Women, Infants, and WIC program, that was from the Black Panther Party and implemented as a social program by the federal government. But when you talk about an organization such as this and the coalitions that are being established as a result to, as was said in the video, it's not about opening the system. It's about dismantling the system that keeps racism and classism and all of these isms in place. And I think that when you present this image of these coalition builders who are working for social justice and social change for everyone, it becomes a threat to those in power. And this is why the Black Panther Party is presented in such a way. And just to give, a parallel, one of the things that I used to share when I was teaching at Butler, one of the other moments in history that young people don't really learn about is the Haitian Revolution. Why don't you learn about the Haitian Revolution? People hear about Haiti in the 21st century, and there have been other politicians who have used derogatory terms to talk about Haiti. But Haiti, in 1804, became the first Black nation in the Western Hemisphere. They beat the French, they beat the British. Louisiana is a state because of the Haitian Revolution, because France could not maintain its empire. And that was coalition building in the Caribbean. But we don't talk about these things because then it gives the people a sense of, what if we can still do this together?
Right.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Shirley just said so many amazing things. I just wanted to...
This is a dialogue.
Just because what you said about what if people believed and started asking those questions just reminds me, I was in Oakland last fall for the 55th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, and I originally felt really self-conscious being like, all power to the people, because I was like, I don't say that in my normal day, or in my normal life, but as I kept saying it over and over again and feeling empowered by the people around me who are elders, but also young people still doing the work of the Panthers, right, in Oakland, I was like, this phrase also is a part of me. And what if I believed that and acted in a way and lived my life in a way that was seeking coalition and seeking empowerment and seeking all these things. So build bridges, and also just kind of like see what we could achieve in our world. I'm sorry for belaboring, but
Well, the thing is, and this is the reason why I brought this question up is because, and this is the reason why I have this film selected about the First Rainbow Coalition, because of the image that people want to portray with the Black Panther Party, and I'm not going to date how old I am, but many people in my family talked about and actually talked about what was happening in the 1960s and the need of change, and so when you say our power to the people, it resonates. And it makes sure that you can take down layers of whatever you think that is elevating you. We all become one. Isn't that true? So that's the reason why I wanted to say is that the very first, I didn't even think about it, but I did write one of my papers when I was getting ready to go to apply for graduate school was about the Black Panther Party. And somebody said, "Are you kidding me? I said, "Yeah, I'm going, what's the problem?" And so I don't know if they were just fearful and let me in or not, but I was so fascinated about the Black Panther Party because I didn't know enough about it, and also wanted to, and I also went to a predominantly Black school, and that was one of the things that I didn't understand about the free breakfast program that everybody was enjoying, and I didn't understand that came from the Black Panther Party. So there's things that we don't know that resonated, and really we need to understand that this coalition that we were talking about, First Rainbow Coalition, touches everyone, doesn't matter who it is. And then one of the things I want to add is we're in a pandemic, right? And when 2020 happened, when we first found out about COVID, there was people who did not think and would not even believe that they would need food. Found themselves in food lines, going to the food pantries, and didn't realize that if you had a mortgage or a rent, you might be evicted because you can't pay your bills. So those free programs that came about, originated by the Black Panther Party, people are taking advantage of now because it's for everyone. So, but anyway, I wanted to go on to the next question so we can have more dialogue. The other thing I wanted to talk about was reflected in the very beginning of the documentary about Chicago being known as the most segregated city in America. Let that sit for a little bit. Chicago was known as the most segregated city in America. And Chicago had a race issue. Let that sit. Because when we start talking about the civil rights movement, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and the civil rights movement has not stopped. I just want to say that. Let's keep that in mind. We always think about the hoses and the dogs and the murders, and we think about the southern states and the marches and things like that. But it's very interesting that this film opened up with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talking about the most hostility that he felt. Now get this, he even said, not just in Mississippi and Alabama, but the hatred was seen in Chicago because of this closed society where segregated societies were supposed to be just kept in one place, in one community. So I want to talk about and really ask you both to comment on the racism that we don't think about and talk about in the northern cities. We think about northern cities as a place of multicultural, embracing all communities, but there is covert and overt systemic racism that we don't talk about. So can you give me your thoughts about that? Because it was very powerful when I first saw this film, and I thought it was very fitting that Dr. Martin Luther King came out and said that, as well as others in the film.
The North is, as a historian, I'm always one to, caution people on their forgiveness of the North. And being in Indiana, one of the things that you constantly constantly hear, oh, this was a free state. Just because slavery was quote unquote illegal does not mean that there were not enslaved or indentured people in these spaces. There were, specifically in Indiana. And just because the institution of slavery was outlawed in a northern state or became outlawed later down the line, like you see in spaces like New York and Connecticut, so on and so forth, does not mean that it lacked racism. And I think that's one of the key things folks have to understand. Just because someone did not approve of enslavement did not mean that they were anti-racist. It's two totally different things. And so what you have when it comes to the North, of course, you have in the antebellum period, there are plenty of people who are benefiting in the South from enslavement, obviously, whether it's through rice, tobacco, other forms, or other crops, or what have you. But those raw materials are coming where? To the North. Mm-hmm. And so the North does definitely benefit from this institution. And once this institution is abolished, it still functions in many ways in the South. You have sharecroppers, you have tenant farmers, you have an entire region of people living in poverty. And so what they do, they decide that they're going to come north with this expectation of increased wages, better living, more opportunity, economic opportunity, but also the potential for social capital as well once they come to the North. And it's not just Chicago, it's New York, it's Detroit, it's all of these cities. My grandmother was one of those folks who came to the North from Sunflower, Mississippi. And she was born in 1937, so she came in the second wave of the Great Migration. And for those who are listening who've never heard that term before, the Great Migration is a term that's given to literally this mass movement of African Americans from the South to the North at the turn of the 20th century, 1920s. There's a second wave in the 1950s. And now there's a third wave, because Black people are moving back down south.
Yeah.
Right? So we could have an entire conversation about that. But her first stop was Chicago in 1955. And if you talk to my grandmother, she remembers everything. She's 85. She'll tell you that growing up in Mississippi, she never encountered racism. She was never called the N-word until she came to the state of Indiana. But she spent 3 years in Chicago. All of her brothers were there. I still have family in Chicago. My grandfather still lives in Chicago. And it's still a very segregated place. And as Dr. Jones said, once they got there, those expectations of financial mobility, social mobility were shot because of wage discrimination, housing discrimination. You find yourself, much like what the video was saying, in slums for poor whites found themselves in slums, but you also have the creation of ghettos. And then later down the line, you have things like redlining that prohibited people of color from actually purchasing homes in various spaces. But this idea that the North is somehow this better space socially is a myth. You see it in Chicago in 1919. We know that as the Red Summer, and there were more than 26 race riots. We call it the Red Summer because of just the sheer number of people who were murdered that summer. And Chicago was one of the sites of one of those 1919 Red Summer riots, where there was a young Black boy who was swimming at the beach at Lake Michigan, and white beachgoers started to stone him because he crossed the imaginary line that Black people weren't supposed to cross. And that, amongst so many other instances in the city of Chicago, raised racial violence, racial tensions, and this was not uncommon in the North. You see the same thing in New York City during the Civil War, the New York City draft riots. There were Irishmen who were upset that they were being conscripted into the Union Army. And so instead of taking their grievances to Union Army leadership or to the federal government, they began attacking Black people in the city of New York, in Manhattan. And this is in the 1860s. So this idea that racism or the North is somehow some magical place where it all goes away, it is an epic myth.
I would just briefly piggyback off of what Charlene just said, to say that that is very true, and also the machine in Chicago had a vested interest in keeping all these communities separate, right? There's a great book by Liz Cohen called it's about Chicago and migrants, especially European migrants to Chicago between 1917 and 1930. It talks about another wave of Black migrants coming up as well, who are all working these Pullman jobs, being highly exploited, and forming coalitions. But those coalitions were broken up by the government agencies, right? So kind of like what that man said, who was part of the Young Lords Party, he was saying their coalitions were being torn down by bureaucracy. That racist bureaucracy has persisted in the North and feeds into the South in ways that we often don't see because of how the South is described as the racist space or the space of slavery. But really, that racism is throughout the country. And I'd also like to say that when you were talking about the northern states, we also think of the North, I think, as just upward from the South. So, Philly, New York, Chicago, but also these same kind of practices were happening out West, right? Because Black people, especially in the state of Louisiana and other southern states there, were moving out West and settled in places like Oakland or LA, right? And in LA, they were facing these same kind of things, right? Huey P. Newton, in his autobiography, talked a lot about how in Louisiana, they left because they were hoping for better economic opportunities, better economic growth. Where they were from, they had limited space and limited room for the family to grow, so they moved north hoping for a better life and encountered even more poverty, right? And so you have the kids of these civil rights leaders, the kids of the generation after, growing up seeing the battles that people fought in the South against civil rights, moving north, realizing it's the same thing and saying, how can we organize to make this better? And how can we take that tradition from the civil rights movement and push it even further?
But you said something about, in the film, they mentioned the coalition being destroyed by bureaucracy. One of the other things that folks tend to focus on with the South and they ignore the North, when they talk about COINTELPRO, these things are happening in the North. When you go through and
right.
You can go online and see whatever the FBI is willing to release, or whatever they've been willing to release. And that includes Dr. King's file, and you can read Malcolm X, you can read Huey Newton, but
any of the great leaders.
But it's going to be redacted.
Right.
So what little words you can see. But these things are not happening in, Tougaloo, Mississippi. They're happening, these informants that are attempting to infiltrate and collect information on the Black Panther Party, on the Nation of Islam,
right.
on the Young Lords, on SNCC, because Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, was another person that J. Edgar Hoover targeted. But these surveillance tactics, it's not that they didn't happen in the South, but they are happening in Philly. They're happening in New York. They're happening in Boston. And so we can't put this onus on just the South. People leave the South. It's not a geographic issue, and that's what we're not addressing when we give grace to the North. Classism doesn't have geographic boundaries. You don't have poor people in the North, you have poor people out West, you have poor people in the South.
Right.
There's no geographic boundary there. So,
Well, I also wanted to not just look at Chicago. And when a couple days ago, I asked my mom about this, and I posed a question to her, just to kind of see how it worked. And she talked about, just like many of us, families that came up from the South, came from Mississippi. I think we're related, Dr. Fletcher.
I wouldn't doubt it.
I think y'all are related.
Family is also from Mississippi.
I think we're related.
I wouldn't doubt it.
I wouldn't doubt it. But one of the things that they stopped in Indianapolis, and that's where they had either choice. My mother's family had a choice to go to Indianapolis or Mobile, Alabama. But one of the things that my mom did talk about was the differences. And you're right about not seeing certain things in the South because, quote unquote, it was already there. She knew the place, just like Bobby Lee was talking about. You knew what to do, to step off the sidewalk, you knew that. But when she talked about living in Indianapolis and, growing up here as opposed to the South, that this was supposed to be, quote unquote, the promised land and a land of opportunity. And she talked about, and my dad too, talked about how it was hard for them to get a job. Even if you had the skills, you were being looked over because you were not the right color to get in the offices and have an office job. She even talked about, and this is Indianapolis, I'm just relating it because we're not too far from Chicago. There are certain recreational parks you would not go to on certain days maybe, but you couldn't go on freely. Certain places you couldn't go to in Indianapolis and still can't go to. Let's talk about that. But one of the things she did point out was that this was supposed to be the North. Somehow it was, like you said, an imaginary line you crossed over, that racism was going to be somehow disappear. But it was very much here, settled, but it was here, and you knew that it was here. So I just wanted to bring out that question because as like I said in the beginning, Chicago was known as the most segregated city in America. And that's powerful. Not that many people would say, Chicago? But yes, it is. The other question I wanted to really talk about, and I hope I got the scholar, I tried to quote her because I kept listening to it over and over again because it was very powerful the way she described the Rainbow Coalition as an organization that gave voice to the voiceless. Their activism demonstrated that ordinary people can change society through collective action. Let that sit for a minute. Ordinary people can change through collective action. The Rainbow Coalition, which is highlighted in the documentary, looked at a lot of social issues in 1969 that we're still dealing with today, such as, discrimination in healthcare, housing, food insecurities, police brutality. My question is, like the Young Lords and the Young Patriots and the Black Panther parties, and even the American Indian movement was a part of that. The Asian groups were saying, well, we can unify. Can there be a rainbow coalition, a multi-ethnic group that can fight for social change? Or do we have one already? What do you guys think?
I'm of the mind that I just asked my mom this question yesterday. So I watched the documentary yesterday, just to be prepared. And I was like, Mom, I wish there was these groups that were existing today. And literally later in the day, someone on Instagram posted a story of how children and youth in Chicago, in Oakland, and all over in New York are forming these coalitions currently to protest against how the school systems have been dealing with COVID and how they have not been working on behalf of the youth, but actually working in their own self-interest without taking into account how they have to live in these realities every day, right? So I think that kind of like what Bobby Lee had told, I guess, Hyde, is if you want to start organizing, just walk out your door, look to the north, south, east, west, and just pick a direction, right? Like, I think it's always ongoing. And the more I study social movements, sometimes I've gone even as far back as the Haitian Revolution and before, like, when I'm looking at it, the work never stops. It's always ongoing, right? And I think certain people get highlighted and you get a soundbite here or there of, oh, this person is doing something big, or Black Lives Matter, when it first arrived on the scene, was extremely, extremely important and moving, right? But I think that, like, highlighting these little sound bites of activists here and there does not actually show you the work and the consistent work that is always happening, always ongoing, right? Like the NAACP is doing work. In different communities, you may have the Urban League doing work. You may have Black sororities and fraternities doing vital, important work, right? Uplifting people in different communities, churches, different groups, right? Like when I was in California, I was so inspired by this group of activists working out of Sacramento called the Neighbor Program. And they're redoing kind of these programs with the Panthers, but with Panther guidance and leadership, right? Mm-hmm. So you have Black Panthers coming in and showing them, this is how we taught people. This is how we did our political education classes. This is how we did this. I even learned, talking to Emory Douglas, they have an advisory council of civil rights leaders guiding them as they form the Panthers, right? So like the idea that even we can segment this into, oh, this is the civil rights movement. Oh, this is the anti-communist movement. Oh, this is the communist movement, I think. But you know, like, if we segmenting these groups and segmenting these things, we are all building upon this legacy and leaning on each other as we learn how to build these coalitions in continuation, right? Mm-hmm. From each generation to the next. Mm-hmm. So that is my first answer to your question.
No, I completely agree with you. It reminds me of the prison abolition movement. And after years of working in the prison system, not as a guard, but as someone who my job was to help people get out and stay out of prison. But you have coalition building in that movement with folks who are not only formally incarcerated, but who are actually involved in the system. They see the problems with the system, that the system needs to be completely removed, but it also connects to other things. You talk about school children. We don't invest enough in the school system, but you can trade in the prison system on the stock market. Now, a lot of people don't know that, but you can invest in private correctional companies, Correction Corporation of America, the GEO Group. You can purchase stock in prisons, but what you have is a system that's structured. If you invest in education, it's going to take you 18 to 21 years to get a return on your investment, because that's how long it takes people to get out of school, right? But if you invest in the prison system and you start arresting children at 6, 7, 8, 9, they continue to come back in the system, and by the time you turn 18, you can keep them longer than you did before. You get an immediate return on your investment because prisons function the same way that hotels do. The longer you stay at the Marriott, the higher your bill will be. So the longer you incarcerate folks, the more money that's made. It's modern day slavery. But within this prison abolition movement, you have people who come to the table who are fighting in the interest of folks who are formerly incarcerated, who are currently incarcerated. You have educators coming to the table who are saying, my students aren't getting what they need, but you have enough money to build this jail over here, and we don't have books.
Right.
You have, you mentioned the organizing around Black infant mortality in the 70s. You still have those same issues today, and there are people within the prison abolition movement who are fighting for when a pregnant woman, an incarcerated woman, is pregnant and is about to give birth. There are still states that shackle them. Where are they going? So you have in this singular movement, there's so many factions that are coming to the table, and that is another form of that coalition. Coalition doesn't always necessarily have to be rooted in race,
Right.
Because what's happening here with the Rainbow Coalition, it's rooted in class.
Mm-hmm.
Poor people are getting together and saying, we deserve access to our human rights.
Right.
Period. Point blank. It doesn't make a difference if you're Black, if you're white, it doesn't matter. We're poor and we do not deserve to live in slums like this. So when you have folks with shared interests, we can build a coalition because one system, dismantling one system will dismantle another and another and another.
I would like to proceed with my second answer. This also reminded me of what you were saying about coalitions not having to be along racial lines. It reminded me also of the way that the Panthers built on this legacy of international activism across different lines as well, right? Especially across the line of anti-colonialism, right? Especially many Panthers thought of the United States as a colonial and imperial nation, right? An imperial capitalist nation. And so they could align with different, especially African countries, who were in the process of defeating colonialism at the same time, as well as Indian and Asian countries, right? So and that's building upon a legacy that was already preceding them as well, right? You had W.E.B. Du Bois, who was traveling around the world, Paul Robeson, who was also traveling around the world, and his wife, Esmonda Good Roberson, who I think needs to be highlighted even more, who spent an extensive amount of time in Africa and in Asia. She was traveling everywhere on behalf of the Comintern, learning about how people wanted to go about achieving freedom and learning different ways to achieve that same type of freedom in the United States, right? How can we advocate for Black lives as well as African lives, as well as Asian lives, right? So this is taking place on a global scale, not just in the United States. And I think sometimes the United States actually just mirrors what's happening already in an international sphere. Because Black people, everyone is traveling everywhere and getting ideas from everywhere, right? That's how I started my own research on the Dalit Panthers, is being like, how far are people traveling to get this information, to understand how to be liberated, to understand how to kind of expand their own vocabularies about what is possible. It's through these legacies, deeply, deeply rooted legacies of travel and mentorship about how to be free.
Don't take my last question.
Oh, okay.
I do want to say is that this is the reason why I selected this documentary, because most people don't really think about unifying and the unity of movements. And the first Rainbow Coalition, now I heard about Rainbow Coalition from Dr. Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and his coalition. But I didn't know where it was rooted at. And I love Fred Hampton. He's charismatic, he's a great leader, and he's a great speaker. But he had something when he talked about fighting racism, but also making sure that we unify, right? And so that's the reason why with this this screening of the First Rainbow Coalition, and I was really, when I first saw it, I just was all over it. Like, whoa, this is hot. Because most people are thinking about their own issues. But one of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about was the Poor People Campaign. And he talked about poverty. It crosses all kinds of lines. You know, you're poor, you're poor. You're hungry, you're hungry. You need housing, you need housing. And that was one of the things that his final chapter that he did not get a chance to complete was the Poor People's Campaign. And unfortunately, he went to Memphis. But he was really into talking about alliances. As you heard him say that in that short clip when he talked about alliances, because he started to really see as the Civil Rights Movement was tearing another chapter, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all of these groups were turning a chapter, right? But he also saw there was alliances, because even with Malcolm X, and that's another story, because most people want to talk about Malcolm X, we can't touch Malcolm X, we can't talk about Malcolm X, but the thing is, it's a whole other story. But one of the things was, there was an alliance. Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X came together to have a common ground. And so that's why I said that there's a lot of things people can unify. And just like you said, it cuts across classes. And that's the reason why it's important to look at these movements that you mentioned, Ms. Patterson, about can we have these movements? Are they being formed organically? And that's why I posed that question, because I get energized. And as you know, sometimes I say, you gotta let the young people get in there. But I got one foot in there and one foot out, because I was like, let the young people get up in there, because there was a moment when I was doing my little thing. I'm not gonna let it age me. But there was a little time with Fight the Power, you know. I was looking at that and Spike Lee and all that stuff. But I think it's important to really focus on these movements, these new movements. And we all saw from wherever you were at, May 25th, 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, and how that kicked off a social movement, and people were just upset about this. Can this really be happening now? In the middle of a pandemic, and there was coverage over international. And I could see the movements, people marching, getting in the streets. Doesn't matter what was going on, they got out there. I wanted to get out there myself. But that's why I wanted to ask that question. Our last question, before if there's any questions from the audience, is really going to be, Dr. Fletcher, you can jump in, but it's really directed to Ms. Patterson and her work. Yes, I wanted you to get into that. The Black Panther Party, as you mentioned, and the Rainbow Coalition work was appealing not only in America, as it said on the screen, but internationally. You touched on it a little bit. That's why I said, don't take my question now. Don't take that. Yeah, okay. Please elaborate on the international influence of the Black Panther Party. I know you can go, so let's hear it.
Okay, all right. Well, there were several. Okay, so first of all, the Black Panthers set up an international headquarters in Algeria in 1969 that was led by Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, who was also the documentary.
We're not going to get into that either, because that's a loaded question. I met her, but it's a loaded one.
Oh, that's fine. I was just going to mention that they were there. And while they were there, they were, of course, traveling between Algeria and France, because it was a French colony previously, and also London, right? And so while they were in London, there was a Black Panther Party set up by both South Asian and I would say African Black activists in London. There was also a Polynesian Panther Party, and one of the activists, Connie Matthews, was setting up a Panther Party in Sweden. So there was a European front, and there's also the Dalit Panthers in India, and the Polynesian Panthers, the Israeli Panthers, and the Palestinian Panthers. There were all these iterations of the Panthers that took place during the time of the Black Panther Party, or shortly after. And I just think it's fascinating because a lot of them would create their own either manifesto or 10-point program or 12-point program. And the Dalit Panthers, which is my area of expertise, looks at the untouchable community in India, who is being brutalized by the police as well. No access to fair housing, even though the Indian Constitution has a system called reservation. That's supposed to allow a certain percentage of jobs and educational opportunities for the Dalit community. many of those opportunities were being outright denied or just researched through upper caste or like the upper caste hegemony. And so the Dalits were feeling very politically, emotionally, socially, culturally repressed. And they looked towards the Black Panther Party as, and their 10-point program especially, as a way to articulate what they wanted to see in their own societies, right? Because many Dalits at the time were living not even in houses, but in places called slums, right? Where it's just like brick walls and things like that, right? And so they were organizing though in the slums, right? There's a really amazing photograph out on the internet. I want everyone to look it up, where they show the Dalit Panthers kind of like organizing in this room with a photo of one of the famous Dalit activists and Bedford, just talking about like writing out their kind of manifesto about wanting fair housing, wanting right to education, wanting an end to police brutality, right? And so when we start thinking about the Black Panthers and their legacy, I really think about how the things they asked for were just basic human rights, right? And I think when I was at the 55th anniversary, I kept hearing, you know, this is a humanitarian organization. And as you think about it, it really is, because it's providing for people what the government should be providing, but isn't. What our society should be providing, but doesn't. And that is really a humanitarian cause. So I think I'm going to stop there, but if you have some follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, well, I just wanted to give a chance for anyone in the audience to ask some questions, because we've been having a great dialogue with Dr. Fletcher and Ms. Patterson. Do we have any questions in the audience or anyone? Or from Facebook Live? Want to acknowledge them?
Well, I'll ask a question, no one does. Is there anyone else? No. All right, so this is much it's kind of a personal history and observation as it relates to, Marion, you said earlier in the screening of how the Black Panther always has the militant look. So it's always a way to basically create fear in Black people. So Mayor Daley and his group obviously go in and they go into the programs, like the children's programs for feeding and such, and they destroy that through violence. However, I was born in Tennessee in 1961, and I'm actually part of the Great Society because I was in the very first Head Start program in the county school system I was in. Here's my point. You've got a white president creating a great society with programs like Head Start that's addressing poverty. I can still remember, this was obviously the year before my first grade because it's always that age group. Laying on mats, getting a meal, all white children. However, when I entered the first grade the next year, the school that my older siblings went to, the one that I went to, became completely desegregated. So starting in first grade in that school, I had friends and classmates that were Black youth, but I didn't see them beside me in the Head Start program. Here's my question: when we have programs of the government that appropriate those types of things, what is the role today in government? You have Johnson's Great Society, you have all these different things. How are we going to get to the point where all of these things that we've talked about, defeating poverty, hunger, medical issues, how are we going to elevate this? Because here we are 55 years later, and we're still talking about it. So, and is it government? Is it movement? Is it both? And that's the question. You're talking about, can we have these coalitions today? And what happens if these things get appropriated again?
What do you want? I can
What's your thoughts? I have thoughts too.
Okay, because I think it might, in my opinion, I'm just going to go off what I've been reading. So when the Panthers first started out, and especially like in building these coalitions in Chicago, they weren't worried about the political arena at all, because they were like, we are focused on helping the people. But I think later we saw when Jose Jimenez started running for office, Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown in Oakland also ran for office because the charges that were being brought against them were draining them economically. So they could not actually do the work to help the people. And so I think that it has to be on both spectrums, unfortunately, especially, and because without the financial resources to help the people, it's hard to sustain a movement. And two people can't sustain a movement. And we all need to, and movement leaders also need to have time to invest in themselves, right? Like they can't be burned out like so many activists we have seen done in the past, right? And so it needs to be on all cylinders, but that calls for a major transformation of society in the way that we think about how we do government and how we enact change, because it needs to be both the movement and the politics working back and forth in a dialogue, not antagonistic. That's my original thought. But Charlene, I'd like you to pick it up from here because I know you have some great insights.
Well, I mean, we have a lot of these issues because of government.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say it. I mean, you know, Johnson, while he's got some pretty amusing phone recordings that you can listen to on YouTube, Johnson was part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It was Lyndon B. Johnson who said, if I can get the lowest white man to think he's better than the best black man, he used the term color, then I can not only get him to vote the way I want him to, but he'll just let me dig right in his pockets. So government has to take a look at their role with adhering to social contracts.
Big facts.
There's that.
Yes.
Because if it does, the vigor of these movements may not necessarily be needed. And so we're talking about the Black Panther Party, and y'all brought up the 10-point program. Love it, absolutely. Black Panther Party was established in 1966. But when you take a look at other organizations that predated the Black Panther Party, you can look at any issue of the Nation of Islam's final call, what the Muslims want and what the Muslims believe. It's the 10-point program. Mm-hmm. You can take that back to what social changes Noble Drew Ali wanted with the Moorish Science Temple. It's the 10-point program. Right. Let's go back to Marcus Garvey. It's the 10-point program. So these are conversations that we have had. And even going back into the 19th century, when we talk about when historians talk about Black nationalism and things of that sort, Martin Delaney was a pastor talking about what would evolve into the Panthers' 10-point program 100 years later.
Absolutely.
So it's I agree with you. You're absolutely right. It can't be this antagonistic pushback. But if government is not adhering to the social contract, we're going to continue to have these conversations. Because when you have police who come into neighborhoods who put their knees on people's necks for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, you are clearly violating the social contract.
Right.
When you have children who cannot have access to clean drinking water, didn't they just fix Flint's water? Okay.
And the fact that it was working for so long.
How about that? So there's several layers to this conversation, and if government is not adhering to its responsibility with regards to the social contract, we are going to continue to have these movements. We're going to continue to have these conversations, because at the end of the day, it will be the people who suffer.
Right.
And at some point, the people will get tired of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So,
do we have any other questions from the audience? I want to pick up on that too, and then we're going to close. Because when you are, and thank you for that question, Norman, Ms. Patterson and Dr. Fletcher, when you were talking about not being combative, the movements can't be combative with government, but we are really stuck when we are looking at voting rights, right? We're really stuck. And I know that a lot of social organizations are going to be using or pinpointing Dr. Martin Luther King holiday as looking at and talking about voting rights and making sure that we can get those bills passed. But my problem is that here we are again, just like Norman said, here we are again with the same thing happening.
Yes.
The conversation still is there. And you know what? Even if you run for office, or you think about running for office, if the grip is so tight on you to even have any kind of say, you need the vote. You need the power of the vote. And so when I hear about movements or the power of the vote and rock this vote, I remember all of those, come to get together. You're right, Ms. Patterson. These movements can't survive without financial support. But also the politicians that we elect need to be able to hear what we are saying, not what they're wanting us to say. And what also, that's what I'm doing. So I'm looking at and thinking about, we're going to continue having these conversations with the government's got to listen. And people are going to raise up. And when the people rise up, you're going to have, movements, you're going to have marches, you're going to have outpour, and they have to listen. And that's what's happening now. When we look at the voting rights, and here we are reversing a lot of things that a lot of the movements, a lot of the people that died to make these changes is happening. And I'm not just only talking about voting rights, but climate change. We can go down the line, we check the boxes, that things are reversing itself, that we were supposed to be enjoying as American citizens or citizens of whatever country you're in. Because this is national, international too. Because we can see it going around. But I also wanted to say is that thank you so much for the dialogue. Because Dr. Fletcher said it is the dialogue. And I didn't even get to all my questions. Because she said, let me just tell you, are you wanting us to talk? How long you want us to talk? And I was like, I just got all these questions. And she said, you might want to trim that down. So she helped me trim down because I had a couple more questions. But I want to say thank you, Ms. Patterson, because it's been enlightening to hear your comments and also to learn about your research, because that is really powerful, and that's to you on your dissertation completely, because we want to hear that. And always you're welcome back to have some more dialogue and conversation. And of course, no stranger is Dr. Fletcher. We go way back. So I just want to say thank you again. I want to say thank you again, Dr. Fletcher, for engaging us in this conversation and having a chance to bring out some thoughts and for us to feed on and to really take the time to look at social movements and the way we think about history as well. So I want to say as a conclusion, if you haven't had a chance to, please complete the survey. You have to have a chance. There is a survey for us this evening. And also to join us for our 2022 MLK Day event, which is Monday. My gosh, we're going to have so many things going on. Our topic, our theme is social justice. And we're going to have a community marketplace. We're going to have performances and a mural art piece that's talking about social justice. And the quote, I want to read this quote entirely because this is what our whole theme and our whole Martin Luther King Day event is based on, because I didn't want to get stuck on I Have a Dream, and I didn't want to date it into a 1963 speech that he did, and sometimes we only see those little, I don't want to say it, sound bite, I think it's a second, because the whole speech is entirely longer than that, and also there's many things that was happening on March on Washington that day. But this same quote came from 1963 when he was writing a letter in the Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of neutrality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Thank you, Dr. Martin Luther King, for that. And thank you all again for joining us for this wonderful conversation.